Okay, I got it. I can do this. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Lynn Pollack, and I am one of the leaders of JVP Chicago. And before we all get started, I just want to recognize and thank the other chapter members who helped put together this event, especially Ariel Ziantz, Elaine Bachman, Joel Finkel, and the crew who came early to set up. This is a very exciting time for Jewish Voice for Peace, both on a national scale and here in Chicago. In the last year, JVP National has grown from 30 chapters to more than 60, and from 130,000 supporters to more than 200,000. In Chicago, we are hiring our first staff person who will be joining a 15-person strong and growing national organizer team. Interest in getting involved at JVP Chicago is growing at unprecedented levels, and we're hopeful that with this growth and the addition of professional staff, we will be able to be more visible, have more capacity, and be more effective in promoting an alternative approach to looking at the Israeli-Palestinian impasse. It appears that the message of a just resolution that hinges on equality is one that resonates with many. So tonight we delve into a very timely issue, that of anti-Semitism and the conflation of that hatred with legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. We are honored to have as our speaker tonight writer and activist Antony Lerman. His work on anti-Semitism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and multiculturalism has appeared in such major periodicals as The Guardian, Haaretz, and the London Review of Books. From 2006 to early 2009, he was director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, a think tank on issues affecting Jewish communities in Europe. He's a founding member of Independent Jewish Voices, and the author of a memoir, The Making and Unmaking of a Zionist. He also wrote one of the most talked about pieces in the last year, the New York Times article, The End of Liberal Zionism. Tony?
Can you hear me? Is that, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you, Lynn, very much for your introduction. It's also a pleasure for me to bring the greetings of the organization that I was partly responsible for founding, Independent Jewish Voices, to you. We are a much smaller organization, barely an organization, all volunteers. We have no paid staff or anything like that, but we are in the same business as JVP. There are differences, as we know. There's a lot of differences between a lot of the groups that are critical on this issue. But I bring you greetings from them. They are, by the way, having an important conference at the end of this week on equal rights for all in Israel and Palestine, where there will be some very significant Palestinian and Israeli speakers discussing that as one of the new approaches that's now being talked about, alternatives to partition in Israel and Palestine. So, we're talking about Israel and anti-Semitism and the challenges that the relationship between the two pose to diaspora Jews. And what I'm going to do is divide my remarks into three parts, really. First, I'm going to look at the connection between Israel and anti-Semitism. Then I'm going to focus on anti-Semitism, what it is today, how serious it is, problems with distortion and misrepresentation, exploitation, and then finally to look at what the challenges are to the diaspora and how they might be met if they can be met. And I want to start by saying that for me that two pictures come to mind when we think about how Israel relates to the question of anti-Semitism. And we've become very familiar with the first picture recently, the picture of Israel as the defender of the Jewish people against anti-Semitism. We've become familiar with the picture of Bibi Netanyahu standing up, speaking on behalf of all Jews in response to some of the events that have been taking place in Europe. You may recall the words that he said when he went to Paris after the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the Jews that were killed in the supermarket there. To all the Jews of France, all the Jews of Europe, I would like to say that Israel is not just a place in whose direction you pray, the state of Israel is your home. He also said, in some other connection, something which also has a relationship to anti-Semitism, the Jewish people will defend itself by itself against any threat. That's what the Jewish state is all about. And this image of Israel and its relationship to anti-Semitism is carried through the Israeli government. Foreign Minister Lerman is quoted as saying, "The best precaution for Jews may be immigration to Israel." This playing the role of leader of the Jewish people, speaking on behalf of the Jewish people, as I say, has become very familiar to us. And it is certainly part of this package of presenting Israel today as this bulwark against anti-Semitism worldwide. The other picture comes to mind is not quite so pleasant, if I can put it that way, in inverted commas, pleasant. And this other picture itself is not pleasant, because the other picture is one of Israel exploiting anti-Semitism for its own political purposes. Now, when you say that, some people just say you're being entirely cynical, falling for the anti-Semitic messages of Israel's political enemies. But I say, no, that's not the case. And indeed, Israel does exploit anti-Semitism for its own political purposes. Now, I think this isn't to say that there aren't many among Israel's leaders who care about the fate of the Jews worldwide. There's all kinds of ways of caring about Jews, and I'm sure that there are many who do. But it is to say that at best that care, that concern, is ambivalent, and at worst it shows an utterly cynical disregard for Jews and Jewish life elsewhere. I mean, just take the statement that I read out from Bibi Netanyahu at the beginning, where he talks about, I would like to say that Israel is not just a place in whose direction you pray. He's addressing the Jews of Europe. Well, the vast majority of the Jews of Europe hesitate to know exactly what their religious feelings are, but certainly very few of them are praying in synagogues today, because most Jews are secular, so who exactly is he talking to? And then, Israel is not just a place in whose direction you pray. Well, Jews who do pray, as we know, they pray to Jerusalem. They pray in the direction of Jerusalem. They don't pray in the direction of the state of Israel. That's not what the tradition tells us. So it seems to me that there's a kind of cynicism in the language that's being used even to defend, to put over this image of Israel as the defender of Jews, and it's very much a language which is addressed to other audiences and for other purposes. And I'm pleased to say that, of course, when Bibi spoke in Paris in the synagogue there and gave this very strong message, Jews should come to Israel and Israel will defend them, that one of the responses on the part of the French Jews in the synagogue there was to sing the Marseillaise. I think that did say something about the way I think most French Jews feel about the message that they're being given by the Israelis. Now, the fact is that historically, and up to the present, for Zionism in Israel, anti-Semitism was and is both enemy and friend. Now, we know that despair at the failure to overcome anti-Semitism in Europe was one of the main impetuses for Zionism. It was one of the things that Herzl was supposed to have felt that drove him to develop the idea of political Zionism. They wanted to get rid of it, but they actually knew that they needed it to further the Zionist project. And indeed, Herzl himself used anti-Semitic tropes in arguments that he had with his Jewish enemies, particularly the Ostjuden, the East European Jews, who weren't immediately convinced by Zionism. And in his arguments with them, and his criticism of them, things he wrote, he used anti-Semitic descriptions of them and what they looked like and how they spoke in his arguments. We know also that once settlement began to develop in Palestine, and as came to the war and the Holocaust, that Zionists put the cause of Zionism above efforts to save Jewish lives. In the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion felt that it was more important to think about the future than simply to think about saving lives. And after 1948, we know that Israeli agents provocateurs were active in various countries, particularly in Iraq, in provoking incidents that led to a Jewish exodus. And in modern times, today, last 20, 30 years, Zionists still see anti-Semitism as their ally. I was very struck once when I was in Israel in 1998, and I was listening to a very respected figure in Israel, Aviezer Ravitsky, who, a modern Orthodox Israeli, very critical of the occupation, a Zionist, but with a significant critical voice. Unfortunately, he was in a very terrible accident, and he was his functioning ability was very severely impaired. But he was talking to an American audience, and he said the following. I wrote it down word for word because I thought this was important to have on record. He said, "We Zionists," I think he said this with a slight tongue-in-cheek, but there's meaning behind it. "We Zionists have an evil inclination that anti-Semitism will flourish in the West, but no Jew will be hurt." And I think that kind of sums up a lot of what many people who call themselves Zionists, and certainly in Israel, Zionists would say.